So welcome everyone. My name is Matt Bowker and I manage Rhodes Scholars virtual lecture series, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. So these lectures are free and available to Rhodes Scholar participants and for anyone who loves to learn. This series of online lectures is critical to helping us pursue our not-for-profit mission of making learning accessible to as many lifelong learners as we can, including those who do not have the physical ability or financial means to travel, or leave their homes to join us on a program. Ultimately, this series would not be possible without the support of participants like you who have funded this project through generous donations. So please consider making a donation to Not-for-Profit Rhodes Scholar so that we can continue to provide educational experiences both in the virtual classroom and beyond. So please visit rhodescholar.org/give to show your support with a monetary donation. Every dollar helps. So while Rhodes Scholar is headquartered in Boston, we have offices and staff around the world. And today, you'll be hearing from Dr. Matt Palzinski. Matt is an art historian and consultant who believes that art-related experiences can teach us so much about ourselves and the world around us. He's based in Palo Alto, California, and has given hundreds of art-related lectures for Rhodes Scholar, but for also museums, universities, and organizations around the world. So before we begin, a few quick notes. Matt will present for approximately 30 minutes, after which he will host a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session. Now, during this session, you can submit questions using the question and answer icon located at the bottom of your screen, and then afterwards, I will read a question live for Matt to respond. Now, should technical issues force you to miss any portion of this webinar, don't worry. We'll be adding a recording of this lecture to our online virtual lecture library. And finally, at the end of the Q&A, you'll be prompted to take a very short survey. And just like on any Rhodes Scholar program, we ask that you take a few moments to fill it out. Your feedback is helpful to us and will help us grow and improve our virtual lecture series. So let's have a warm virtual welcome for Dr. Matt Palzinski.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone who put this together. There are a lot of moving parts to all of this. So thank you for the wonderful team at Rhodes Scholar. And welcome to all of you. It is 8 a.m. on the West Coast. It is 11 a.m. on the East Coast. And we are here to do two things. One, in the first half, take a look at some of the key highlights of the work and life of one of the most interesting artists, certainly one of the most compelling artists in not only the history of modern art, but in the entire canon of the history of art, and that is Vincent van Gogh. We'll look at works that many of you will have seen before. We'll look at some of the stylistic underpinnings of those works. We'll look in context to see how some of those works relate to key artists working in France at the same time that Van Gogh did. Then we take a nice break and we come back for part two, where we continue our discussion of the life and work of Van Gogh, but with a particular emphasis on the letters, the comments that he himself made in relation to some of the works that we've all come to know and love. So we begin here in the very early years. We're looking at a drawing, Barn and Farmhouse, from his time in the Netherlands. This is a work that on its own won't give us too much information about Van Gogh. It won't even foreshadow the signature work that will come later. It won't tell us much to know about the iconic series of sunflowers or self-portraits, but it does give you a nice example of the kind of artist that we're dealing with, the kind of boyhood of the artist that we're dealing with. Here, Van Gogh is 10 years old. He is living in an upper middle class family. His mother is from an upper middle class family from The Hague. She's especially focused, so the biographers tell us, on running a tight household, keeping up with bourgeois appearances and the like. His father is a minister, so we have a combination of two top-down, strict, influencing parents in his early year. His namesake, Vincent, comes after his paternal grandfather and after the name of a stillborn, born exactly a year before his birth. There are other siblings, Theo, the very famous brother that helps him throughout his life, but also three sisters. Before I go on, I want to just underscore that point there, that not only is Vincent named after a grandfather, he's given the same name as the stillborn, born to the family a year before. And I want us to just sort of put that somewhere in the back of our mind as we're exploring his life and his art. That's a very unusual, very interesting little piece of his biography. What was this boy like when he was younger? We know that his personality was, again, according to the record, according to some of the biographies, serious, thoughtful, reclusive. Certainly he was self-conscious, suspicious of others, and so on. We're looking at here in his earliest drawing, he's about to turn 11 in March. By all accounts, he's a rather unusual young man, thick curly red hair and a very strange penetrating gaze and not a whole lot of interest in socializing. We know from his biographers that he is described as a strange boy. His face was odd, oblong with a high brow and prominent chin, puffy cheeks, shallow set eyes, and so on. Shortly after this drawing, his parents sent him off to boarding school where he felt abandoned. This was something that we'll see throughout his life, and then ends up switching schools not long thereafter. Here we meet him a few years later, 1870 to 73. And if you're keeping count, Van Gogh's birth year is 53. So here we are, about 17 to 20 years old in The Hague. As mentioned, his family connections in part are from The Hague. He's very attracted to the city. He goes there July 1869. His uncle got him a job there, working for the art dealers Gruppel and C. This is a relatively happy time for him when we compare it to other much lower moments in his life. He's starting to look around the world of The Hague. He's starting to become very interested in architecture and how to depict architecture. And you can see this here again at the left, sketch for the Binnenhof in The Hague. Again, these two early drawings won't reveal too much about him to us. But we know young boyhood, 10, 11, now 17, 20. He's taking art seriously, largely self-taught artist, but is looking around the world very carefully. You could say that here we have a precocious artist starting to come to terms with how to see the world around him. And then here, and we don't have to go through all these dates, you have a reminder of how full his young adulthood was and how often he moved from here to there as he eventually gets settled. As mentioned, he's at The Hague in 1869. He ends up living in the UK with stops in Brixton and South London. By 74, the gallery sends him over to Paris. They transfer him back to London. They transfer him back to Paris, and so on. It isn't until 1886 that most art historians are primarily concerned, where he moves to Paris and his life takes an entirely new turn. But in the earlier years, we do get a sense of what kind of artist he is endeavoring to be. We don't get a sense of what kind of artist he will become, but here we are around 28 years old, and he's starting to examine some of the key traditions of the history of art, certainly coming from the Netherlands, the key traditions of none other than the still life. The Dutch have been very fond of the still life for quite some time by the middle of the 1800s. Objects placed seemingly at random on a table don't necessarily tell us everything that there is to know about life. But what they can tell us, if you're looking and watching very carefully, is about the small moments. Meditation on life's fleeting moments, on objects that we use in life and objects that we discard, on our drive toward the future while we are perhaps not paying as much attention to the present as we could be. Still lives are designed to cause a certain amount of meditation on the brevity of life, a meditation on the quickness of it all. References here to the artist, the hat, the pipe, and so on. We start to see him in this wandering, restless phase in his late 20s and early 30s, moving around Belgium, moving around the Netherlands, sometimes in and around both of his parents' houses, trying essentially to figure out where to go from here. Still in the early years, he's now about 30 years old. This is 1.5 years later, still very much in his wandering phase. It's a very interesting work. It starts to give you a sense of one of the subjects that Van Gogh will later on come to know and love. And of course, that will be the subject of flowers. Here, flowers in beds, very typical Holland, but also how even within those beds, flowers have their own restless energy, just like him. A combination, if you will, of flowers growing free and wild, but also wedged into their compartmentalized boxes. We don't want to read this semi-autobiographically, but certainly there is a way to look at this as something of a metaphor for who he is at this point. Free but caged, all together, not unlike the flower beds that he depicts here. By about 1885, it becomes clear. Now remember, he's born in 53. So here we are, not fully formed as an artist, but at a point where he's starting to break out and he's starting to lay down some of the foundations for what he thinks it means to be an artist. He's looking around the world, he's seeing people in various emotional states, from perhaps the very low to the very high on a nice long spectrum. A similar spectrum can be found socioeconomically as he looks at the world around him. He's trying to figure out who he is to some extent vis-a-vis the socioeconomic world around him, the religious world around him, the pictorial world around him. And at the left, he's going toward humility, intentionally choosing models that are ugly, intentionally coding the picture at the left in a kind of religious meditation, a kind of emphasis on the important things in life, community and food and breaking bread around a table, and not on the superficial things, how one looks, how one dresses, even to some extent how one behaves. This becomes one of the great early pictures, but one, again, that will be so different from his later work. Certainly it's not nearly as colorful as we will later see, and it's so forlorn, a kind of emotional pallor that will change as he goes forth. Let's compare this at the right. This isn't much later. The middle of 1886, the following year. Still the same palette, but now we're starting to see the heavy browns of the typical Dutch palette used in the service of self-expression. Here, a self-portrait. This is a reminder that after he goes to Paris, where he now is at the right, his work continues along some of the same lines as where he had been working in the Netherlands. He has a number of firsts on the Paris trip, including his earliest known self-portrait here, and a year later his work evolves considerably, much more toward his signature style. Again, we want to credit Theo here with supporting him financially, supplying painted materials, and so on. Let's go back to the portrait, but compare it with now one more year jumping ahead. We've gone through some of the early years, and now we're putting some pins on the board to see how we can understand Van Gogh's developing signature style. The thing you should be doing here, looking at your screen, is to be comparing what you see here in terms of color, terms of vibrancy, terms of brushwork, how choppy it is at the left, how different it is, how Van Gogh has clearly moved away from traditional representation of the right and is moving somewhere else. He doesn't know where he's moving, and we can see where he's moving only with the benefit of hindsight. But here something radical has happened in his work. As he's living in the small second floor place with his brother, he is starting to think about breaking free from the mold and starting to think about the artists who are working around him. At the left, a view from Theo's apartment. Again, we see something so different from those earlier works, much more atmospheric in the sense that we can see the moisture in the air, maybe a bit of the morning dew or even the fog. Also, he's fallen under the sway of Impressionism, which by 1887 has already been exhibiting for every bit of 13 years. Impressionism, a movement from the 70s and into the 80s of capturing a fleeting moment in life, of emphasizing spontaneity, of using impressions of scenes to capture the essence, capture the gestalt, rather than completed little parts of an image. Much more sketchy, much looser, more avant-garde for sure. This was certainly not beloved by the 1880s by any stretch. Here at the right, one of the many people that he comes into contact with, a household name, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, an image that tells us a lot of things. One, a bit of what he looks like, a bit of his serious side, but two, coming out a bit, tells us who he was connected with. And here, in the circle of some of the most interesting artists working at that time, some of the most celebrated artists working at that time, Toulouse-Lautrec was very taken by the bohemianism that is populating Paris at the time, very taken by these café concerts, these musical establishments associated with the Belle Epoque. At the left, very taken by the setting of the Divan Japonais, now called Le Divan du Monde, the divine of the world, an artist's section in Montmartre, a café concert within that very intriguing section of the epicenters of art in Paris. So he's coming into contact with some of the greatest artists of his time. Here, still in Paris, about 34 years old, he paints the first of two series of sunflowers. To start with, these are always much better up close. So if you can, bring your nose to the closest part of your screen and take a look within, that would be better. Or if you've seen these in person, recollect what it was like, if you did, to stand near them. If you haven't yet seen these, put these on your bucket list. Get as close as you can to them. You should be looking at the brushwork, the very thick, almost impasto, very sketchy brushwork. You should be looking at the immediacy of that, the kind of quickness with which Van Gogh paints. He's pushing paint around. You can almost feel his emotive state here. You know that Gauguin, a figure who plays largely in his life, will acquire two of the Paris versions, and he, like so many people after them, saw these as just something very different. A take on the still life, yes, a take on the meditation of things gone by. But here in the cut flowers, another layer to the leitmotif, a kind of life that once was that no longer is, a kind of looking closely at something in front of you that used to be living. It's in Paris that Van Gogh, like so many artists and writers and people generally around him, becomes very taken by Japanisme. Japanisme is a bigger overarching umbrella term that art historians and cultural enthusiasts alike point to in the second and third quarters of the 19th century in France. It's a moment when enormous amounts of work from Japan is flooding the market. Works by the likes of Hiroshige, Plum Orchard, at the right. Van Gogh is looking very carefully at this work and trying to adopt some of the same patterns and stylistic tendencies. In other words, instead of trying to make the picture three-dimensional, as per the European tradition, he's attempting to make the picture more two-dimensional, as per the Japanese tradition. Hiroshige and then Van Gogh after layers the image so that we have these two-dimensional pieces, one on top of the other, all the way back. But none of it is done with a kind of softness that you would expect of actual perspective, a kind of tendency to understand the world, including its atmosphere and so on. At the right, very clean, very straightforward, very two-dimensional, something so unlike what was happening in Europe at that time. When we think of Japanisme, there are a couple roads that led to it. One, of course, is the Convention of Kanagawa, March 1854. We're looking at here Commodore Barry, who oversaw the Convention of Kanagawa, and apologies for the wrong text slide here. This is, in fact, Commodore Barry, Commodore of the American Navy, overseeing the convention signed under the threat of force, the convention that ends Japan's isolationist period and precipitated with so many of the later treaties. Again, apologies for the title here at the bottom. This is an image showing you the Treaty of Amity between France and Japan, a treaty that comes right after the American treaty at the same time. It opens Japanese ports, places like Nagasaki, and it allows foreign citizens to live and trade in the port cities. These are very important moments in the opening up of Japan. Eventually, we have Godai Tomoatsu, who worked along with the newfound treaties as a powerful businessman from Satsuma to lay some of the foundation for how art gets disseminated in Paris. Here, an image of the 1867 Parisian Exposition, where many of the works, hundreds of prints and so on from Japan have now come to rest and be seen by thousands. And so while Van Gogh is in Paris working on Japanisme, and that was just a quick run through, there's obviously much more to talk about, he is also pursuing other lines of inquiry. From Paris, he takes his interest in Japanisme with him when he moves to Arles, February 1888. He's 35 years old, and you can see here, just from the very subject of this, the bridge, how it almost feels Japanese-like. We would put this in the same category as the work after Hiroshige, a kind of subject matter born out of the opening of Japan and the flooding of the market in France of so much Japanese work. This starts to look a bit more like signature Van Gogh here. We are on the softer side of the palette, leaning into the richness, leaning into the saturation that he becomes so very well known for. Greens are getting greener, blues are getting more imaginative and whimsical, all with the eye of trying to mimic some of the Japanese art that he becomes so fascinated with. Here, still at Arles, again, mid-30s. By April, he's starting to approach his subject differently, and he's starting to approach nature certainly differently. He's out in the fields. He's getting closer and closer to trees. Less and less figures and narratives populating his imagery, and more just the byproduct of a communion that this one individual has had with nature on this sunny afternoon. He's eliminated all the extemporaneous themes, and he's given you something that is downright jubilant. It shouts spring and renewal. It looks like we're seeing more and more animated trees and more nature akin to his signature style. In Arles, by August, he comes back to his beloved subject of sunflowers. This is about a year after the first series in Paris. And again, we want to be looking for a few things here. One, his interest in nature. Two, how he's eliminated anything in the way of that. So it really is just nature and him. Sometimes it's nature and him outside. Sometimes it's nature cut flowers inside. But even when we're inside like this, he's eliminated any of the background information. We find flat walls in the back and empty tables upon which vases rest, bringing our full attention right to the heart of the flowers. And at the right, a detail of just how textured these are, how thick, how impasto, how three-dimensional like some of the brushwork is as he pushes it around the canvas. Still in Arles, later in the summer and into the early fall, Van Gogh becomes very taken with exterior scenes, nighttime exterior scenes, a mix of nature and figures, moving ever toward a kind of poetic, philosophical way of reading the world around us. You might be very taken by nature, you might be very taken by celestial objects and the like, and if you're not, you might once in a while look up at night and be tickled by the stars anyway. This is a bit more of an interest for Van Gogh. This is a moment at night outside that he's very creative, and he's becoming more prolific by the day. And he's looking to the outside world, and he's looking to nature as a mirror to himself, as a soothing antidote, to be something that he is not. Still that summer into the fall, we see Van Gogh's interest in exterior scenes, especially exterior scenes in nature, evolve into exterior scenes at night, both outside and inside. Here are two images surrounding the subject of a cafe, what happens at cafes. How do these relate to the life that he's living? How color affects mood, and so on. Certainly by fall of 1888 in Arles, he's thinking very much about the colors he's using and about which colors to put together. At the left, the yellows and the blues, how creates a certain emotive quality, bright for the cafe and blue for the cool night. Or at the right, how mixing the red wall and the greenish ceiling creates a certain amount of discordant rhythm with color. A kind of situation where as we process color perceptually, cognitively, we don't feel perhaps as soothed with colors like this, red and green next door to each other, intentionally now using colors to create different moods of anxiety and so on. We can see this a bit at the right too, where the floor tips and everything becomes topsy-turvy, using the colors to extrapolate on that mood a bit. It's also in that fall in 1888 in Arles that Van Gogh experiences one of the most profound moments in his biography, and that's his connection with the painter Paul Gauguin. They met in late 1887. They exchanged paintings. Van Gogh's brother Theo exhibited Gauguin's work in his Montmartre gallery. There's every reason to put these two together. And then in October, late October of 1887, Gauguin arrives in Arles upon Van Gogh's invitation. Van Gogh went to Arles in part hoping to establish an artist community there in his house. And Gauguin was unfortunately the only artist that he invited that actually came. This is perhaps under Theo's insistence. Perhaps Gauguin went there feeling a little guilty, feeling a little put upon, but again, we want to be careful with how much we lay into this relationship. In the early part of the relationship, we can see at the left a picture inscribed to my friend Paul Gauguin. We see Van Gogh borrowing some of Gauguin's great interests, like large areas of solid color. Look at that beautiful green background at the left. This is right out of the playbook of what he sees in the work of Gauguin. Large areas of color meant to be read not necessarily emotionally the way Van Gogh wants, but more symbolically, in a world where red symbolizes fire and the like. And at the right, we're looking at a portrait of Gauguin of Van Gogh. He doesn't look very comfortable there. This is not a portrait, you might say, born out of a desire to show Van Gogh at his best. We don't really see him here. He becomes a bit of a prop. And those sunflowers, you will have already known, do not have the life or the vibrancy that the ones that Van Gogh paints, certainly. These are two very different artists. Van Gogh looking closely at nature and the internal poetics of it and its emotional resonance, and Gauguin thinking more symbolically, laying his subjects into broad areas of color. We see that here at the left, just before he comes to Arles, and at the right, just after. Gauguin himself has a pretty remarkable life. In 1891, so 3 years after he's with Van Gogh in Arles, he goes off to Tahiti. 1903, he publicly criticized the French colonial governor, and then in March of that same year was sentenced to 3 months in prison and fined 500 francs for doing so. And then in May 1903 dies from morphine. So his life will only take a few more years after Van Gogh's. Van Gogh's will end in 1890 and Gauguin will end in 1891. Gauguin, like Van Gogh, is very interested in nature. Above man is nature, he said. Yet what richness of means to attain an intimate relationship with nature, he writes. Gauguin wrote, "Yet you have fewer means than nature. Will you ever have as much light as nature, as much heat as the sun? How can you exaggerate since you remain below nature?" And he put a lot of these ideas about nature into his own work. Here in his great big manifesto late in life, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? Both artists together will go off and add a significant chapter to art history, certainly late 19th century modern art, but each in their own way. If we look at the picture at the left, this is the beginning to some extent of that relationship. And at the right, this is certainly, if not the ending, the last chapter, the moment where Van Gogh, now very badly wounded from an injury to the ear, has moved away from the hero worship, let's say, and the relationship with Van Gogh, with Gauguin. December 23rd is the date that we give to the ear attack. We don't have all the details. Here's what we do know. Gauguin comes to Van Gogh and tells him he's leaving Arles. He probably didn't want to be there very much in the beginning. There's some kind of confrontation. Van Gogh later calls this an attack. Van Gogh had been drinking absinthe, diagnosed with syphilis, rotting teeth, and so on. Hungry, not selling anything. This isn't a really great moment for him. And when Gauguin tells him he's leaving, they argue. And at some point, someone pulls out a knife, and at some point, a part of the ear is removed. We don't know if Gauguin does this in self-defense. We don't know if Van Gogh does this in some sort of fit of hysteria. We do know that Van Gogh takes the part of the ear over to the brothel where he suspects rightly Van Gogh to be, and he gives it to the proprietor and says, "Give this to Paul Gauguin with the message, 'Remember me.'" Next morning, Van Gogh wakes up in a pool of his own blood, almost unconscious, taken to the hospital, and eventually becomes well enough to start painting his surroundings. At the left, inside the hospital; at the right, the exterior of the hospital. This is one of the most complex parts of his life, but again, we don't want to read too much into it because we don't exactly know all of the details. Eventually, he's in the monastery of Saint Remy de Provence. He's now 36 years old. May 1889, admits himself there. Theo arranged for 2 small rooms, one where he can live, one to use as a studio. And as soon as he gets there to Saint Remy, it's an immediate layer coming off. He begins his irises in the first week, working from nature in the asylum's garden. Look how close you have to be to paint something like this. You really have to get down on the ground with your nose in nature. Does it look peculiar to people around him? It sure does. But he seems to be over whatever caused him to have the falling out with Gauguin. It's here in the summer, in the middle of June, that he paints his iconic The Starry Night. The mood is expressive. The colors are perhaps symbolic of that mood. We've got the celestial world dominated by the moon at the right, by Venus toward the left. This is among hundreds of artworks Van Gogh made that year, created in several sessions during the day. One that shows him how he relates to the world around him and how he projects the town at the bottom right into a scene that wasn't visible to him from his window. He's seeing the world go by. One of the artists around him, Paul Cezanne, was similarly doing this with nature, playing with it, adding different ideas, piecemeal here and there. Here's a detail of the Cezanne to show you how nature becomes brushwork. We see Van Gogh do very much the same thing. Here are more cypresses. At the left, the Metropolitan in New York. At the right, the National Gallery, painted throughout the summer. Beautiful works in some of the great collections of the world. It's in the fall at Saint Remy that he comes back to a subject. It's very interesting that he's painted the year before. At the far left, October 1888, when he's in Arles. This is the room that is in his yellow house, the one he shares with Gauguin. But a year later, after the falling out, after the ear incident, he paints 2 more images of this, a house that he hasn't been in a long, long time. Something that we can come back to in the later part for our conversation. Here's what his room actually looked like at Provence. So he's hopefully imagining something a little more whimsical. Again, another view, the last stop in his life and his career. At this last stage of his career, he's playing with color, he's playing with subjects. Here he's playing with figures that always seem to be a bit removed from him, there but far off in the distance. Figures that don't have faces, foreshadowing the subway goers in Rothko's subway pictures of the next century, and so many modern works where we get a sense of alienation. Another image of figures as they pass by. Look how closely these figures are passing him by, and yet they dissolve in the sort of anonymity of their green faces. It's in this climate that he makes The Wheat Field with Crows. This is after frequent breakdowns in the later years, different suggestions of what's been happening. We think probably now he had temporal lobe epilepsy. This combined with the residual effects of general ill health and venereal disease and poor nutrition and the like just paved the way to his last moments. July 27th, 1890, he's 37, shot himself in the chest with a revolver. There are no witnesses. He walks back to town. Attended by 2 doctors, they couldn't remove the bullet. Theo rushes to his side and he dies 30 hours later. His last words, "The sadness will last forever." I want to think about this as we look at some comments and as we get prepared for part 2, where we dig a little bit deeper into some of the key moments of his life. But now I think we have some time for an intro to our Q&A.
Hey, Matt, thank you very much. So we have time for just a few questions. As a reminder, you can submit your questions using the question and answer icon located at the bottom of your screen. So, not surprisingly, we have a lot of questions. And the first question is a broader question. This is a question from Margot. What is the essence of Van Gogh's appeal to those who find a deep connection to his art, in your opinion?
Thank you, Margot. This is a question that I don't know that I can answer, but I will, for you, take a stab at it, because it's very hard to know what people see in art. I know what I see, you know what you see, and each of what we see is dependent upon how much experience we've had with art, or perhaps experience with the time period, or experience even with Van Gogh's work. So I don't really know what other people see, but what I see over and over and over again in any conversations about Van Gogh that I've been involved in is that most people see him as someone who was trying to evolve. Someone who came from step one, went to step two, who went through his early years a bit lost, tried to become religious person, fails entrance exams to seminaries and the like, and then found art, did it very well, especially against all of the prohibitions against him as an individual for being kind of eccentric, prohibitions against the kind of art that he was making, and so on. And yet he made things that are very beautiful and very poignant and very simple and very direct. So I think the appeal is from a multifaceted position. One, he's like all of us, just trying to evolve in life. So we see that in his work, perhaps. Also, it's not hard to look at. It's very comforting work, most of it. It's very colorful. It's very unique. It's very playful. A lot of us have connections to nature. So I imagine if we start to unpack what we all see in him and why maybe he's become so iconic, I would start there.
Thanks, Matt. So we have a couple questions about religious themes and the role religion played in his life. So the first question is from Sarah, and Sarah asks, did Van Gogh ever use religious themes the way Gauguin did?
Good question. Religious themes. Did he use religious themes in the way that Gauguin did? These are sort of two questions. One, did he use them? Yes. We can look at when and how effectively and so on. Two, did he use them like Gauguin? So let's take them in turn. One, did he use them? Van Gogh's father was obviously devout and religious, and Van Gogh tried to follow suit with that, what we can understand maybe as a shared passion, but that doesn't seem to have worked for him, as I said, having failed entrance exams to seminary and so on. So he's thinking about religiosity more broadly, and certainly Christianity more broadly. There is a sense in his earlier work that this plays a stronger role. So we see drawings of churches, or even the Potato Eaters, which doesn't look overtly religious, has a religiosity in terms of its morality, in terms of its being humble and being simple people, even down to being not very good looking people. This would apparently endear you to, he felt it would endear him to the divinity behind all of his worship. In terms of Gauguin's interest in religion and Christianity is also a big topic. We know that especially once Gauguin goes to Tahiti after 1891, one of the first things he experiences, and we know this from his work, from accounts of him, is disappointment. He's so disappointed that Tahiti has already been colonized by Christianity. I was in Tahiti in March with Rhodes Scholar, and it is something that hit me too. You almost don't expect it to be as loaded with places of Christian worship as it is. And this was true when Gauguin got there. So instead of trying to document the world around him when he gets to Tahiti in terms of religion, Gauguin leaves it aside and moves on to understanding religion perhaps differently. But both are very, very interested in religion, both more so earlier, certainly Van Gogh. Gauguin is always trying to create a kind of symbolism. What is symbolic of prayer? What is symbolic of fervor? And what kind of colors and imagery would suggest that? Whereas Gauguin is thinking more about almost a one-to-one personal connection to people and to nature. And in those connections sees the divine.
Similarly, what was he looking for in the seminary? Why did he apply?
Matt, give me that question one more time. And we cut out a little bit there.
So he applied to a seminary or a
Yes.
monastery. So why did he apply? And Deborah wants to know, what was he looking for?
Deborah, I would love to answer that. What was he looking for? I would imagine, again, I don't know what he was looking for, but let's all together get in his mind a little bit if we can. You know, he's looking for a change. He's looking for a way to, perhaps in a more formulaic manner, connect to Christianity. He's trying to understand it better from a theological position. And I also think he's looking for a home. He's a bit lost in the early years, and he perhaps assumes, because of what his father does in terms of religion, that that might be a fit for him too, but it doesn't actually work. I get the sense that though he has this interest in religiosity and spirituality and indeed Christianity, it's just not in the same way as so many people around him at that time. I mean, his interest is to use nature and people to connect to the themes of Christianity as he saw it. And I don't think that was what the seminary had in mind. It was a different kind of top-down learning, and it just wasn't quite there to pull out some of his gifts.
So this is also, I think, a question you'll have to speculate on, Matt, but what can you imagine he might have created had he lived longer?
That's a really, really fascinating one. You know, I've been thinking about this more and more, especially now getting ready for it today. How quickly he painted, and especially how quickly he painted once he figured out what he wanted to do. So let's take sunflowers. He identifies that as a subject, and then he dives into it, or flowers up close and he dives into it, nature, and so on. And then he churns through these themes at a rapid pace. I don't almost get the sense that he felt that he would live maybe much longer. Now, again, this is way out of art history and way into just my hunch here, but looking at how quickly he painted, it almost seems like he was racing towards something, racing to finish for some reason. And I don't suggest here that he was, say, suicidal for a long, long time. Let's not use that kind of anecdotal hunch. It just isn't fair to him, or I think it may be even accurate. But certainly toward the end of his life, he's running and racing to finish. So I don't know that he thought what he would have done later, or what I think he would have done later. I think, though, if we look at his work, he would have, like so many artists around him, Gauguin and Cezanne, just continued to perfect his medium and to take the skills that he was really good at and minimize and perfect them more and more and more. But again, he's not a very clumsy painter in the last couple of years, so maybe we would see a lot more of the same. I don't imagine there'd be great big leaps into other territories.
So this will have to be our last question of the session, but we're getting a lot of questions about this, so I think it's important to ask. Why was the ear such a statement?
Yeah, you know, this is one of those subjects that's very much at the top of biographers' lists. You know, what's he like in terms of religion? What's he like in terms of his family life? What's he like maybe in terms of his private life? What's he like in terms of his relationships? And how do his paintings express any or some or all of that. And the ear comes right into that host of questions. It's very hard, number one, to psychoanalyze someone from as far away as we are in space and in time. That's not very helpful if we're trying to get a full read of him. What we'll end up doing probably is relying on a lot of hearsay and a lot of stories retold over time and a lot of our own hunches about what we think. And the ear is a little bit of that. We have some of the anecdotal or some of the factual evidence. As I said, the ear gets sliced a bit somehow. He wakes up the next morning, Gauguin is out and so on, but we don't really know all of those details. And it's a similar story with the end of his life forever. It's been assumed that it was a suicide by revolver, but then later has come the suggestion that maybe it wasn't a suicide, that maybe it was some sort of accidental or intentional death from a 16-year-old in the town. So a lot of these big stories, his death, the ear, we just have the data that we go on. And I'm not surprised people are asking, because it certainly becomes a major moment for him. What I will say is very interesting, though, is though he cuts off part of the ear, or someone cuts off part of the ear, it's within the next year he's already, I won't say moved on, but it certainly doesn't seem to have stalled his momentum artistically. And he even mentions Gauguin after the fact, not as if, Gauguin the potential murderer, but, mentions his art and what's been selling and so on. So that alone is very compelling to me. If something went on that caused this huge breakdown in the friendship, why is he so cavalier about mentioning him not long after? So there's so many parts we just don't know, including a comment by Gauguin very late in life to someone else, way after the fact, that Van Gogh knows how to keep his secrets. He said to someone, Gauguin, he didn't mention the ear or anything in particular, but he said, Van Gogh went to his grave keeping secrets. So what does that mean? Does that mean there's more to the story than we know? So it's just fascinating. And of course it keeps us thinking about him.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Those were some tough questions, but I think you answered them with as much grace and speculation as you could. So thank you to everyone that signed up today. And if you're interested, Rhodes Scholar has even more online learning opportunities, not just for virtual lectures, but we also have one-day programs and multi-day programs. And Matt, I will see you later. And thank you to everyone. And again, if you've enjoyed this presentation today, please consider making a donation to Not-for-Profit Rhodes Scholar so that we can continue to provide experiences like the one today. Matt, thank you.
Thank you all. See you soon.